So welcome everybody to our live whole group question session for moral psychology. I want to thank everybody who has submitted questions. Even if I don't get to answer them now, I will answer them eventually. These questions are extremely valuable, and I think you'll agree that those who ask questions have done a fantastic job. Thank you, Jagoda. That's very kind of you to mention that. So I have got a couple of your questions in there, and we'll come to the third question at the end, perhaps. Let's see. Right. Okay, where am I? Sorry, I realise what I've done actually. I've got the wrong device up. Bear with me a second. There we go. I knew there was something wrong. Now, the first set of questions that I got this week all concern in one way or another direct insight or the role of intuitions. And these are important questions, and they're going to stay with us actually right to the third part of the course, which is about implications for ethics. So several people, when they were writing to me about why they were taking the course, mentioned that they were coming at this from ethics, and they were kind of curious whether moral psychology can tell us something about ethics. I'm curious about that too, and that's really part 3 of the course. But you'll see that we've been sort of previewing that, and we've got some questions that are going to be relevant now and later. So Hannah, congratulations, you had the first question, thank you for that, this week. And the question is very simple. What direct insight are other philosophers claiming to have into moral properties? What direct insight, asks Hannah, are other philosophers claiming to have into moral properties? And this of course relates to the Sinnott-Armstrong et al. Rejection of direct insight. So these researchers are saying there are other philosophers who claim that that you can have direct insight into moral philosophy properties, and we, Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues, are saying that that's false, that's demonstrably false, because the affect heuristic explains moral intuitions, and the affect heuristic, like all heuristics, is only a reliable guide to truth in familiar situations. Now, more about that later. So what is this direct insight? Well, those authors, Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues, cite a book by Stratton Lake, an edited volume from 2002. And I was dismayed when they did this, because what they do is they cite a book with 12 chapters, and then they leave it to me or you as the reader to work out where in that book of 12 chapters this direct insight appears. Now, if you're writing an essay, I expect you to do better. So if you want to say, philosophers claim direct insight into moral properties, you don't cite an entire edited volume, you give me a page number, right? You give me a page number, and I will do the same for you. So anyway, I went to this edited volume, and I thought I'll have a look at the introduction, and that was rewarding, because in the introduction they say, epistemological intuitionism is the view that certain moral propositions are self-evident, that is, can be known solely on the basis of an adequate understanding of them, and can thus be known directly by intuition. So I take it that this captures what they call epistemological intuitionism, captures the direct insight that you are asking about, Hannah. Now, I don't want to go further here, because this book isn't available electronically to us, and given how we're set up at the moment, I think it's very unlikely that you will be able to access this book. It's going to be very difficult to get hold of it, and I don't recommend. But it's quite an interesting book, but I don't recommend buying it unless you're particularly interested in the topic. So what I'm going to do is take a further answer to Hannah's question, not via this book that you can't access, but via online resources that you can access. So this Audi 2015, the reference will be in the notes below. This is one of many papers that you can easily access online via the Warwick Library system. So Audi is a proponent of what we might call direct insight, although he doesn't use that term. Oh, and I should say thanks to Paul Theo, who put me onto Audi last week. So I'm grateful to you for that, because I hadn't actually considered this before, and I think it's quite helpful. So Audi starts with the idea that intuition is a resource in all of philosophy, but perhaps nowhere more than in ethics. Episodic intuitions, he says, so the kind of intuitions that hit you when you're thinking about a particular case, can serve as data. That's odd, the language of science coming in here. I wonder why that's happening. And then he goes on, beliefs that derive from episodic intuitions receive, on the face of it, justification. on the face of it justification. So it's not that the justification can't be overridden, but there's some justification for accepting them. And then he goes on, and he really, I mean, his view really hinges, I think, on this idea about self-evidence. So he goes on to characterize what he calls self-evident propositions. Long story short, a self-evident proposition is one where understanding it already provides you with justification for believing it, and believing it on the basis of understanding it provides you, entails knowing it, says Audi, entails knowing it. So Hannah, I think this is a paradigm example of a philosopher who is claiming what Sinnott Armstrong and colleagues characterize as direct insight. What Sinnott Armstrong and colleagues are arguing is that people have the kind of illusion that they have access to self-evident properties because of the way they're wired to make judgments about particular cases using the affect heuristic, where you're tracking how something makes you feel and being disposed to make a judgment about the rightness or wrongness of it. And because that, the way the affect heuristic is operating in you is something that you're not generally aware of, it's kind of discovery that that works. Philosophers have come up with a kind of explanation of what's going on in terms of self-evident propositions. And what Sinnott Armstrong and colleagues are saying is that the experience that philosophers have, the phenomenology of all of this, is causing them mistakenly to think that something is self-evident, but it's got nothing to do with that. It's all to do with the way that your emotions inform your ethical judgments about particular cases. All right, so Hannah, your question was, what direct insight are other philosophers claiming to have into moral properties? And this is quite a deep question, actually, so we can go on later in the course. We'll talk about rules on reflective equilibrium, and we'll look more at Audi as well. So there's quite a bit of work to do here, and it may be that other people like Paul Theo have answers to this question that I'm not even aware of. So I would like you, please, if you have answers to Hannah's question or suggestions, please do put them in the chat below or email me and Hannah and let us know about the answers to that question. And I will be very grateful for those sources. I'll be very grateful for those sources. Can you tell I'm learning about this as I go along? Does that show? I think it probably shows. Let's see. All right, now, Jagoda, your questions actually come later, but I put your second question here, Jagoda, because it relates directly to Hannah's question. Sorry, this is really difficult. You've got some great questions this week, so I absolutely have to have a cup of tea while I'm thinking about this. Let's see, Hannah, you're welcome. So Jagoda, how does implication 2, why is the affect heuristic significant, defend consequentialism? Now this needs a tiny bit of spelling out here. So here's the background to Jagoda's question. Consequentialism appears to have some counterintuitive consequences. For example, in the transplant scenario, which involves abducting a healthy person, taking their organs out and dishing them out to 5 individuals who need organ replacements. So what's often said is that crude forms of consequentialism imply that we ought to do this, no less than if a trolley is heading towards 5 people, we ought to switch it onto a track so that only 1 person is killed. We ought to always think about the consequences of the action. Now, of course, I'm not saying that this exactly is the problem for consequentialism, because what often happens in response to this is that consequentialists get a little bit more elaborate, and they introduce rules or long-term considerations or something like that. But the point is still that consequentialism can seem to have counterintuitive consequences. Further, the counterintuitiveness of those consequences seems to be an objection to consequentialism itself. So the idea is this: I've got a view, I propound my view about what it is for something to be morally good or morally wrong. And then you say to me, Steve, but if you were right, then it would be okay to cut you up and distribute your organs, even though you're perfectly healthy. And now I'm supposed to say, oh, that seems wrong, therefore I'm going to reject my view. That's how the argument's supposed to go. And of course you can see that in a lot of philosophical discussion. Or I'm going to revise my view. And in particular, this will flow from Rawls' ideas about reflective equilibrium. You will definitely get counterintuitiveness as a problem. Sorry, I'm just looking at Paul Theo's comment here. Thank you, Paul Theo, that's very helpful. All right, so the counterintuitiveness is an objection to consequentialism on the face of it. But what Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues are suggesting is that if we accept that the effect hypothesis explains moral intuitions, then those intuitions will be reliable only in familiar situations. Familiar is a technical term here. So these are the kind of situations which we encountered or our ancestors encountered during the evolution of our moral abilities, the moral abilities that underpin the intuitions, including the emotions. So what have we got here? The idea is this: the defense of consequentialism proceeds by saying what appears to be an objection to consequentialism here is not really an objection to consequentialism if you consider seriously that the moral intuitions are underpinned by emotions like disgust. Once you get that, you realize that those moral intuitions just can't be reliable in the kind of cases like transplant, because transplant was never a live option to our ancestors. So a case like that, of course, our moral intuitions are not to be trusted and relied on if the effect heuristic is responsible for them. Okay, so Jagoda, let me check in with you. Please let me know, have I answered that second question? Is that clear? Why the claim about the effect heuristic is supposed to provide a partial defense of consequentialism? Do let me know. Do let me know. All right. Now, I'm coming to a set of questions. We're still on the broad topic of direct insight and intuition. And Emily, you were first. So Emily, you said, why is the post hoc method, excellent, why is the post hoc method that Schnall and colleagues use unreliable? And here I have a confession to make. So I'm sorry, Emily, I must have been terribly unclear, because I'm not saying, I shouldn't say, that Schnall and colleagues are using post hoc method, not at all. So I think what Schnall and colleagues did, they are, at least Schnall, is a long-standing proponent of a hypothesis about the role of emotion on moral judgments. So I'm not suggesting that they were using a post hoc method. And I'm sorry I wasn't clear about this. What I'm actually suggesting is that Sinnott-Armstrong and colleagues are using a post hoc method because they're formulating a hypothesis about the effect heuristic and then looking back to research by Schnall and colleagues. So I'm going to take your question to be, why is that post hoc method unreliable with that fix? Now, Anna, you asked much the same question. You said, can you explain why the post hoc method isn't a good method? It isn't clear to me why it isn't a good method. And Emily, you came in here as well on this as well. This was one of your questions. I don't see how the post hoc prediction really jeopardizes the evidence for the hypothesis. And I'm really delighted to get these questions, and you'll see why in a moment. And the delight I have isn't that three people asked questions in this ballpark. It's that, as you'll see, Anna and Emily actually provide the material for an answer in the later parts of their question. So look, it's time for a story. It's time for a story. I've got three stories today, actually. This is the first of them. This is the tale of the loaded die. So there are two ways that we could go here. You've got some die and you offer me a game, right? So we're going to play a game and there's real money on the table. And I'm worried about this. I know you well, and you know, not you, of course. I mean, my interlocutor, who certainly isn't you, has a reputation for some shady dealing. So I make a prediction that the die are weighted to the 4. Then we roll the die a few times, and we just observe how often the 4 comes up. And it turns out that the 4 comes up really quite often. Okay, now I think that's pretty convincing, right? Here's a different way we could go. We could roll the die a few times, maybe even lots of times. I observe what number comes up, and I notice that 4 comes up fairly regularly. And so I retrodict that these die are weighted to 4. That's the number that came up most often. Now, the thing about the second approach, this is post hoc, and this is a genuine prediction. The thing about the post hoc approach is that in the majority of cases, even if I'm rolling the die very, very often, there will be a number which comes up dominantly. So the retrodiction procedure is very likely to show, even if the dice are actually fair, that the dice are biased towards one or another side. So more often than not, if you've got a set of fair dice, your retrodiction process will actually tell you that the dice are biased, which is incorrect. So I think you're going to agree with me that the prediction and the retrodiction method are different, and that the prediction method might carry conviction even when the retrodiction method doesn't. Okay. So, gosh, who are you? Emily, Anna, and... Sorry, I've forgotten who you are now. That's silly of me, isn't it? Emily, Anna, and Emily. That's why I've forgotten. Emily, Anna, and Emily. First of all, I want to check, are you happy with me, just in this claim, that this method provides greater conviction than this method? And so there could be situations where we're convinced by the prediction, but not by the post hoc thing. I'm going to check you agree with me about that. But that's not all there is to your questions. The second thing comes from, starts with Emily, actually. She says, showing that there is some evidence that the postdiction is confirmed should weigh in favour of the hypothesis. Now, I agree. Absolutely. I agree with you, Emily. After all, we might be in the following situation. I know that you're a shady dealer, right? And I know that the dice are bound to be weighted, but I've got no idea what number you've weighted them to. You've kept that information to yourself to gain some advantage. Now I want to neutralise that advantage. So what I'm going to do is indeed to keep rolling the dice and see which number comes up most often. 4 comes up most often. So I form the hypothesis that the dice are weighted towards 4. And given my prior conviction that the dice are weighted, this post hoc method actually seems pretty okay, right? It's the best I can do in the circumstances. But there's more. Anna goes on and says, look, suppose that we found evidence using the post hoc method, created a hypothesis, and then tested it with a new prediction. Would that be acceptable? And Anna, now I think you've nailed it, because that's exactly what you do. If you think about it, what you do, this is shady dealer who's got the die. You roll the die, and you see that 4 comes up pretty often. So you form the hypothesis that the die are weighted towards 4. But you're not yet convinced. You're not yet fully convinced of that. What you're doing is what Anna suggests you should do. Now with the hypothesis, you do a new set of observations. You keep rolling the die with the prediction that 4 will come up. And if it does, now you've got me, right? Now you've got that shady dealer. You're pretty sure it's the 4. So what's important here are 2 things. 3 things. Post hoc carries less weight than a prediction being confirmed. But that doesn't mean that post hoc carries no weight at all. On the contrary, I think post hoc can carry quite a bit of weight. And thirdly, the gold standard would be to find some post hoc support that motivates a hypothesis and then test it with a prediction, just as Anna's suggesting. All right, good. So I think those questions are brilliant because they allow us to be a little bit clearer about an important point that's really philosophy of science, but that will help us a lot in evaluating theories as we go on. What you and I are aiming for on this course, and what I would like to achieve myself, and also what I'd like to see you doing, is to generate a theory for which there's significant post hoc motivation that generates predictions that could be readily tested. So even if we're not going to, of course, do some experiments on this course, we don't have time or resources, we're getting to the point where we're constructing theories that we could come to know are true by generating predictions. So my suggestion is, like Anna says, the post hoc provides motivation for the theory, and the predictions allow us to know whether the theory is true if things go well. Okay, good. So Emily, and Anna, I think I've answered those questions, but please tell me if there's something outstanding. Okay, now at this point I'm going to move on to different questions. So far we've been talking about questions that people have asked which have been around direct insight and intuition. Thank you, Emily. Excellent. But Marta's got a different question. So Marta says, what's the difference between biases and heuristics? They seem similar in that they are both kinds of a mental shortcut that enables us to make quicker judgments. All right, so I agree with you. Now, Marta, I know you well enough to know there'll be quite a bit behind this question. So I'm just going to try and answer it taking it at face value first, but of course you can come back to me and push further. So the way I like to think about heuristics is different from other people in the literature that you've seen. I like to think that to use a heuristic is to track one attribute by computing another. That's, to me, the fundamental part about using heuristic. So you'll notice I've got nothing about consciousness in here. I don't think that's going to help me to generate predictions and to explain things. Perhaps I'm wrong. Nothing about availability. So this is how I'm thinking about heuristics. It's not how everybody thinks about heuristics, but I think there's a good reason to go with this. Anyway, that's my take on it. Now, biases. I don't actually know what a bias is, and I'm not going to attempt to characterize a bias. But I can tell you that I have a bias towards accepting claims that accord with my political views. Right. So here's my friend the Puffin, and Puffin and I have regular disagreements. Right. And I find it very hard to accept many of the things that Puffin says because they just don't accord with my political views at all. Right? Yeah, I can't tell them that. That's too rude, right? That's too rude. Our great and glorious leader is nothing like that. The leader of Britain is a hero. I can't believe you're saying those things. Doesn't make any sense to me at all. Right? Anyway, so Puffin and I have these disagreements. Right? You know, I really think we should block up the Channel Tunnel. I think that's really the only way to go. I don't really understand why we stopped short of doing that. And Puffin, of course, Puffin is actually from Europe. Puffin is German. In Britain, we say from Europe, of course, as if that was a different continent. Puffin is actually German, and Puffin doesn't agree with me at all about that. So you can see that I have certain bias, and Puffin has a certain bias. And I think the bias is different from the heuristic, but that they're related. They're related. One of the reasons that I find it easier to accept views that accord with my own political views, right? Our great leader will save us from the COVID, surely, because he's a master of competence, right? I find that very easy to accept. That's because I'm relying on an ease of processing heuristic. Steve, what's the ease of processing heuristic? The ease of processing heuristic is this. I track the truth of a proposition by computing how easy it is for me to process it. So when I come across a proposition, it's often very hard for me to find out whether or not it's true. You know, I'm reading my favourite newspaper, the Daily Mail, or is it the Telegraph? I forget. Anyway, one of those. I'm reading one of those newspapers, and it's very hard to know whether or not what these journalists are saying is true. So what I do is I rely on this heuristic. As I'm reading each sentence, I think, gosh, how easy is that for me to process? And when it's fluent, when the processing is fluent, I go to the truth. I think it must be true. So there's some quite good evidence that not just me, but other people use the ease of processing heuristic. And what you can see here is that the heuristic, relying on that heuristic, is actually a cause of bias. But of course, it's not the only cause of bias here. So I think Marta is right. Biases and heuristics involve mental shortcuts. They allow us, in many cases, to make rapid judgments. They are different. I don't think that the bias toward accepting claims that accord with my political views is the same thing as using the ease of processing heuristic, but they're related in that some of the bias that I have, not all of it, but some of it would be explained by the heuristics that I use. So Marta, let me know how far I'm getting there answering your question. Hopefully that's good, but it's a great question. Right, now, Jagoda, sorry, I've taken a long time to come to your first question. This is a very interesting question. So you're asking a question about... Excellent, thank you, Marta. Jagoda, you're asking a question about a study by Eskeen and colleagues from the lectures this week. And what Eskeen and colleagues did was very simple. They gave some of their participants, let me show you the graph, they gave some of their participants a very bitter drink to drink. Some of them just got water and some of them got a sweet drink. And then they measured, having had this taste in their mouth, how severely they judged various scenarios in terms of being terribly, terribly wrong, that would be 100, or not wrong at all. And what they found is that people who had the bitter taste in their mouth were more severe, tended to think of infractions as wronger than the people who had the water or the sweet taste. So that's the background to Jagoda's first question. And here's the question. How can something such as taste be used to affect moral judgment, since the liking of a particular taste is itself a judgment? The liking of a particular taste is itself a judgment. So what Jagoda is thinking is that many people, like myself actually, enjoy things which are bitter, right? So here's one of my favourite things, and this is indeed quite bitter. And I like something that's bitter, right? I like these drinks that really speak to me because of their bitterness. So surely, right, there's an element of judgment here. Well, maybe. Sorry. So Jagoda goes on, if a participant enjoyed the bitter drink, as I do, they may not necessarily perform the same way as another participant who did not enjoy the bitter drink. Now, there's two things to say here. The first is that, Jagoda, I think you've made this a bit too simple. So you're absolutely right. Mrs. B and I, we disagree about how tasty this drink is, right? She likes things which are cold and fizzy. That's her kind of take on how a beer should be, which is entirely different from mine. So there is an element of judgment. You're absolutely right. But it's not all a matter of judgment, because what you will see is that taste is used by many different animals to navigate their natural environments, including humans, right? So taste has an important biological function. Taste is part of our survival kit, if you were, and a terribly important part of our survival kit for most of human existence. So it can't all be a matter of judgment, right? Because humans notoriously tend to make terrible judgments, Jagoda. They tend to make terrible judgments, and those terrible judgments will quickly lead them to die. So fortunately, what humans have is a small part of their action is guided by judgment, but the majority of their action is not guided by their judgments at all. And that's also true in the case of taste. So the first thing is, Jagoda, if we were to investigate taste and follow up with the researchers like Chapman and some of the references from Chapman and colleagues, I think we'd have to modify this claim. But I don't want to depend on that, because, Jagoda, I also think we could accept that claim and we'd still be okay. Oh, Steve, why is that? Good question. Here's the thing. If you're right, Jagoda, right, so if it's true that some participants enjoyed the bitter drink, that would imply, of course, that they didn't feel disgust. And then we would predict that Eskeen and colleagues should find no effect, or only a diminished effect, of the bitterness on the moral judgments. So this is an interesting objection, because it's an objection which, if it's correct, actually works against Eskeen and colleagues, right? So the more plausible you find Jagoda's claim that the liking of the taste will be a matter of judgment, the stronger the conclusion that Eskeen and colleagues have reached, because they have, after all, then they've been working with the manipulation, the bitterness manipulation, which is not 100% effective, and yet they still found significant results in accordance with their prediction. So I think what I want to say here is this. There's two kinds of objection to a piece of scientific research. One kind of objection is that the researchers in effect had their hands tied behind their back and they still confirmed the prediction. And that makes me more confident in the research. The other kind of objection, of course, goes the other way, that the researchers sort of helped themselves to a condition that made it likely, independently of their hypothesis, that they would find the correct results. And in that case, of course, we would find it an important objection that makes it weaker. Okay, so Jagoda, on this occasion I've disagreed with you on 2 points. I've disagreed with you about whether your objection is correct, and I've disagreed with you about whether your objection undermines rather than strengthens the result of Eskeen and colleagues. So I'm looking forward to seeing whether that's right, whether we agree about that, or whether you've got another round for me. So do let me know. Now, I'm sorry, I should say at this point, so this session officially finishes at 12:30, and I'm sorry that I've gone on a little bit. So I had, as you can see, these marvellously rich questions. And what I'm going to do is just carry on. So you should feel absolutely free to leave. I suppose you feel free to leave and come and go anyway, right? So just in case there's anybody who doesn't, you must feel free to come and go as you see fit. But I'm going to carry on with the last questions that I got, and then also go back to some questions in the chat. But you can treat this as a kind of an informal thing, that, you know, there's no reason why you have to be here for any of this anyway, but especially not this part. Gosh, here we go. All right, Svenja. It seems to me that using the effect heuristic to explain how moral intuitions arise is not sufficient, because then the question arises how the emotions arise. I do like this. I think that's a very good question, how the emotions arise in the first place. Thank you, Jagoda. Okay, good. So Jagoda and I think for the moment, we're okay. I'm going to relax for a second, but you know, I'll be ready when you've got another objection. So I think Svenja's got a great question here, and the question is, look, you know, how do we get those emotions in the first place? And she asks whether Sinnott Armstrong or anybody else has an explanation for why actions trigger certain emotions in us. So Svenja, this is a very interesting question, and I noticed that you've got this why here, and there are lots of different ways that one might try to answer a why question like this, and I'm not exactly sure which things you've got in mind. So what I thought I'd do is I'd just offer one initial attempt to answer that why question, give a partial answer to it, but I also thought I should open this up. So as in the case of questions about direct insight, it might be interesting if anybody else has suggestions about how to answer Svenja's question. So the people here from all kinds of different backgrounds, and there are probably people who know something about this. If that's you, please do drop into the chat or send me an email a good answer to Svenja's question here, and that will help both of us. All right, so what do I think? Let's have a look at some developmental research. So here's a study by Hamlin and colleagues that will be important for us later if we get that far in this course. And here we have the responses of 5-month-olds. Now what's happening is this. The 5-month-olds are being shown a situation in which there is a person acting well and being nice to somebody. Then that's this darker bar. I hope you can see that. There's a darker bar which goes up to about 75 here. And then there's another person which is being unpleasant and taking something away. And that's this light bar here, this lower light bar. And what you're seeing is this, that for the 5-month-olds, they observe the person either being nice and giving or doing something unpleasant and taking. And then they're given the choice of approaching one of the two people. And what you'll see is that the 5-month-olds very sensibly tend to approach the person who's done something nice, who's given, and avoid the person who's taken. That's what 5-month-olds do. And if you think about it, that's actually a very good thing for a 5-month-old to do. So in many, many cases, a 5-month-old is surrounded by a mixture of people. These days, small children tend to be brought up in quite protective enclosures, walled off and all the rest of it, and there are laws. But historically, that wasn't generally the case, was it? So you imagine a 5-year-old, growing up historically in the south of the United States or something like that. It'd be a very dangerous environment for a child. And what you've got here are immediate responses from very early in life, 5 months, right? So mostly a lot of children at 5 months are not even crawling, but you can express a preference for somebody who does something positive, gives, as opposed to someone who takes. So what Hamlin and colleagues showed, one of the things they showed, is that even from very early in life, you have kind of discrimination on the part of humans with respect to moral valence. And you can imagine, Svenja, I think, that this basic capacity to distinguish between people who are pro-social and people who are anti-social would be important not just for humans, but many animals, particularly eusocial animals who cooperate like humans, and many insects who cooperate in the upbringing of their youngs, right? So certainly among primates, but among lots of animals, this is going to be very, very important to do. Now, Hamlin also goes on, we won't look at this today, but she goes on and shows that there's a gradual increase in sophistication. So the difference between the 5-month-old and the 8-month-olds, sorry, it's too interesting, I shouldn't say this, but what's happening with our 8-month-olds here is that the 8-month-olds are like the 5-month-olds, generally speaking, preferring the person who does something nice, gives, as opposed to the person who does something nasty. But have the opposite preference when they've seen someone being really, really nasty, and then the person that they approach or avoid either gives or takes something from the nasty person. And what you see is that the nasty person gets the reverse treatment. So if I do something nasty to a nasty person, a 5-month-old will tend to avoid me, but an 8-month-old will tend to approach me. So what you see here in the first year of life, according to Hamlin at least and her colleagues, is a rapid development of abilities to distinguish between morally good and morally bad actions, as we might say. So Svenja, you asked, why is it that certain actions trigger emotions in us? And I think that's because our moral abilities are a fundamental part of our survival. For example, in enabling us to distinguish who we might approach and who we might avoid, and also supporting forms of cooperative living. And so we need to have these emotional abilities, because to rely on judgments that are, after all, fairly sophisticated and costly kinds of processes would be both too unreliable and too expensive when we're thinking about very early in development, or perhaps animals that are not humans that might have quite limited cognitive capacities, right? They're making different trade-offs between the energy that a brain consumes and the abilities that it provides them. Emotions are part of that trade-off. Now, I don't think that's a remotely complete answer to the question about why, but it might be that there's the beginnings of an answer there. So let's see. And Svenja, let us know in particular whether you had something entirely different in mind. I'm always keen to know that I've missed the question entirely. All right, Svenja, second question. When we talk about an action having the attribute of moral wrongness, and this attribute being accessible to us or not, are we assuming that such an attribute exists independently of us, and that whether or not an action has it is an objective fact? Right, very good. So in other words, what kind of meta-ethical commitments are we making on this course at the outset? And the answer is I'm not sure. I don't know. And there's two reasons for that. I'm not much of a metaphysician, so I'm not really sure what an objective fact is. No idea really. And I'm also not 100% sure about exists independently of us. That's going to turn out to be a fairly thorny issue. But whenever as a philosopher, I often have to say I'm not sure, because after all, not knowing things is what I do for a living. But also as a philosopher, when I don't know things, I try to explain that in a complicated way. So I don't tend to say I'm not sure. I tend to tell you that in a long way. So here's the long answer to that. Think about the attribute of being blue. So I haven't got many blue things, actually, it turns out. I do have a lovely blue jumper here. So here's my lovely blue jumper, for example. This is blue. But the attribute of being blue is shared by many different things. So here's a blue box. Now this is an entirely different shade of blue. I'm sure you notice. It's an entirely different shade of blue, but they're both blue. Right? So there's this categorical blue property, and that's an attribute that some things have and some things lack. So what's interesting to me about this blue category is that there's measurable perceptual divergence, even among monolingual speakers of a language that does have a word for it. So Witzel and colleagues studied monolingual German speakers, and they found that where blue stops and other colours start will vary quite significantly from one speaker to another. But there are also people who lack categorical perception of blue properties altogether. So if you look at the world's languages, what you find is that there's quite a bit of divergence in the colour terms that people use. Russians use, I think, 2 colour terms where a monolingual English speaker would just use the term blue, approximately. And then there are other languages like Berinmo in which there is nothing like the blue colour term. But what's curious about this, and you can see something of that in the notes that I'll put below the recording of this. What's curious about that, Svenja, is that the colour words that you use and have facility with determine where the perceptual boundaries are concerning the categorical colour properties. So what that tells me is that there are people in the world who just don't perceive things as having that attribute at all. And so for them, that attribute would be inaccessible. They might be able to work out that something has the attribute using a measurement device or by asking a friend, but it wouldn't, for them, appear blue at all. Right? There would be no sense in which they thought that that thing was blue on the basis of their perception of it. And we can also talk about something having the attribute of blueness. Now, so here's a more complicated way of saying I'm not sure. When it comes to blue, I think we can say all of this, and I'm not sure that there's an assumption here about the metaphysics of colour, right? I think I can say all of this without being committed to the idea that facts about blue are objective as opposed to not being objective. And maybe I don't have to be committed to the idea that those facts exist independently of us. So I remain kind of a bit sure. So I'm not really sure what to say about the colour case. I'm not really sure what to say about the ethical case. My suspicion here is that we can take a practical approach. So my practical approach is to think that what I want to do is to avoid, for as long as possible, any question in metaethics. That's my practical approach. I want to avoid, for as long as possible, any question in metaethics. And as long as I can do that, I'm happy, right? I don't have to get into that. And so what I'm hoping, Svenja, this is really the answer to your question, what I'm hoping is that the way that we're talking about attributes of moral wrongness and accessibility will be consistent with any reasonable view that you might have in metaethics. I'm hoping that the way we're talking about these things will be consistent with any reasonable view that you might have in metaethics. And that's, for me, kind of keeping out of trouble. I want to keep out of that trouble for as long as I can in order to think about the issues in moral psychology. So, I mean, here it may be that other people have much deeper understanding of ethics and metaethics than I do. So I'd be quite interested to hear not just what you think, Svenja, but maybe one or two other people. If you've got some ideas or some sources, do drop them in. All right. Excellent. So with that, I'm sorry, I did go on a little bit here. I was just overexcited by your questions. I've come to the questions that I got in advance and prepared for. But what I will do, just very briefly, is go back, if that's all right. I'm not seeing new oh no, here's a new comment. Excellent, Svenja, good, very good, that's handy, good. All right, what I'm going to do is go back and Baldwin, if you're still here, let me know if you're still here, otherwise I won't do this now. Send me a message to let me know you're still here, and I will have a read of your question and just try to think of something to say on the spot. Ah, that looks like you are still here, still here. Thanks, Baldwin. Okay, let me have a look at this. Looks very interesting. Everybody could do this with me. If you're still here, Baldwin's question is from 1016. From 1016, so you can have a read of this as I'm reading it. I'm not going to read it out to you, it's quite long. Good, good. Okay, Baldwin, there's something that we're going to agree about here, but also, I think just to keep it interesting, something that we're going to disagree about. But let's just take a look at what Adam's saying here. Oh no, that's not directly related to Baldwin. So Adam, I'm going to come to you in a second. All right, so Baldwin, so first thing I want to agree about actually, and you can see I agree with you because earlier when I was asking, when I was thinking about Jagoda's question, is it this one? Yeah. Let's go. So this is where I was. My suggestion in response to Jagoda's question is that the defense of consequentialism is actually not providing us with a lot. So it's not that we should think that the hypothesis about the effecturistic supports consequentialism against a deontological theory. What we should think is that it allows us to defend consequentialism from certain objections. So you and I, Baldwin, agree about that. You and I agree about that. What's happening here is that we're not a proponent of the hypothesis about the effecturistic might well be a rejecter of consequentialism. Indeed, that's probably my own view, right? I don't really think consequentialism is right. I think that the hypothesis about the effecturistic is wrong, but it's close enough to being true to be interesting. So Baldwin, you and I agree, I think, that one can accept the hypothesis about the effecturistic and reject consequentialism for good reasons. So I think all Senna Armstrong and colleagues are telling us is something a bit weaker, which is that there are some objections to consequentialism which are harder to establish, don't appear to be genuine objections, if we accept the hypothesis about the effecturistic. So I take us, you and I, Baldwin, to agree so far. But here's the point of disagreement, or I think this is a point of disagreement. I think, and it's to this specific thing you say, actually. You say the real critics of consequentialism are other moral theories. The real critics of consequentialism are other moral theories. But I do want to say that I think we shouldn't do philosophy by picking a favourite kind of theory, right? So it's no good if you say, look, I'm a consequentialist, and I say, oh, I'm a deontologist, right? I'm with Hume, I'm with Kant, whatever, right? It can't be a matter of picking sides. It can't be a matter of like, you've got a favourite football team. I think philosophy sometimes is done like that. So am I a transcendental idealist or not? That really does seem to me to be a bit like picking a favourite football team. And it seems to me that it's okay to do that in your free time, right? There's nothing wrong with being a football supporter, but you shouldn't claim that that's a route to the truth. You shouldn't claim that that's a route to the truth, unless it's Liverpool. Then it would be okay. So, Baldwin, what I want to disagree about is the thought that the real objections are the alternative moral theories themselves. I don't think that can be quite right. I think what we need is to try to find arguments, and indeed perhaps even evidence, that might push us towards one moral theory or away from another one. So there is a small point of disagreement between us there in that objection. All right, Baldwin, let me know how I've done there. Broad agreement, but the point of disagreement I think is going to be important. Whew. All right, now, before I go back to Jagoda, so Jagoda, you have a new question that I haven't answered yet, but before I go back there, I want to come to Adam, because Adam, you're following on from Svenja's question. So I'm just going to read what Adam has written in the chat that I hope you can all see as well. Okay, Adam, very nice question, thank you. Adam, I think this is great. I want to go on. Adam, if I may, I want to take you off to this ease of processing heuristic. So Adam, sometimes when we've got this sort of question, it's actually helpful to think about a parallel case. The parallel case might be somehow easier or less confusing than the ethical case. So what I want to do is to draw a parallel in thinking about your objection. So you framed it as a question, but I think it's an objection as well, which is the best kind of question. Adam, I want to draw a parallel between a moral attribute and a truth, which is an attribute of propositions. So I say, I think that humans quite often use the ease of processing heuristic. Some quite good evidence for this, I think. That's to say that we tend to track the truth of a proposition by computing how easy it is for us to process that proposition. The more fluently we can process a proposition, the more we tend to believe it, at least when we're making spontaneous judgments. So we could have two sentences which actually express the same proposition, but one of them can be written in an awkward way and the other can be written in a simpler way. And what you'll find is that people tend to believe the more clearly written sentence more readily than the harder to read sentence, all things being equal. Now, so I think the ease of processing heuristic underlines many of the intuitions that you and I might have about the truth or falsity of propositions. But there are two things to notice here. So the first is that I don't think that this is the only heuristic involved. I think that other heuristics are involved as well. And secondly, I also don't think that it's only via heuristics that we make judgment about truthfulness. So, you know, when I study maths or logic or something like that, I think I'm arriving at judgments about truth and falsity, but it's not only the heuristics that are getting me there. So it must be the view, it must be the same thing in the case of ethics. And indeed, this is, I think, something that Sinnott Armstrong and colleagues would accept, and indeed must accept. They must accept that there are other routes to conclusions about the moral attributes that actions have than heuristics. They must accept that reasoning has a role. Now, one thing that's going to be important later is, what's the role of reasoning? Right? What's the role of reasoning? And you're absolutely right, Adam, that just as in the case of truth, so in the case of truth, we get to difficult and thorny questions involving pragmatists and others about whether we can arrive at truth, right? Whether we can know much about truth at all. And you're absolutely right that that's related to questions about heuristics and the role of reason. Same thing in the ethical case. All I want to suggest, Adam, in response to your question is that it's much too early to draw a conclusion now, because the claims that we have are relatively weak. The claims that we have right now are relatively weak. It's just that the heuristic is part of the process. The heuristic is what can underpin some moral intuitions, but I don't think moral intuitions are the full sort of gambit of moral judgments. I don't think moral intuitions are the full gambit of moral judgments. Theo says, is what I'm proposing a dual system view? Not yet, but I will get there. I will get there. Theo, what I'm going to do in the lectures, but I won't inflict this on you, so it's not going to be directly in the essay, is first of all suggest to you that there are some reasons to be optimistic about the prospects for a dual process theory of moral cognition. Secondly, to suggest that the currently dominant dual process theory of moral cognition is actually appears to have been quite substantially refuted by some experimental findings. And thirdly, to suggest that I don't think that means we should reject dual process theory altogether. I think it means that we should look for an alternative dual process theory. So all of that is yet to come Theo, and it's going to be a sort of relatively convoluted story. But a short way of replying to Adam's question might indeed say, look, if we're dual process theorists, then we think that the heuristics are important, but not the sole source of the moral intuitions, because we always think that there are multiple processes behind them. Gosh, this is getting very exciting. Lewis, what relationship does the ease of processing heuristic have with Occam's razor, if anything? I don't think that they're related. But that could be because I'm completely ignorant. So, Lewis, I think that's a great question. Terrifying one to be asked on the spot. I don't know. If anybody does know, please let me know. Or if anybody finds anything on that question, in particular, if you find anything on that question, Lewis, give me a shout. Anya, can I reach a level of post hoc evidence, as in sheer frequency, quality of evidence, where prediction wouldn't then appear necessary because the high level of post hoc evidence? Yes, I think you can. Is prediction evidence always more valuable than post hoc evidence? Anya, I think you're absolutely right. Of course it isn't. So in giving you the tale of the die, the loaded die, I was looking for a clear case where I could make my point in a way that I think is relevant to evaluating Synod Armstrong and colleagues. But I think you're absolutely right that there are cases where we only rely, lots of cases in science, where we only rely on post hoc evidence.
Steve, I think your microphone's off.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. So why is my microphone off? That's terrible. What did happen when I was teaching last term is somebody rather mischievously switched my microphone off. Sorry, I'm still talking. Thank you. Okay, I hope you can hear me okay now.
Yes, we hear you.
Excellent, thank you. Sorry, so what did happen last term is that people rather mischievously started switching my microphone off. But I thought that was funny, and I was sharing that with some colleagues, and they said, well, we're in Rutgers here in New York, and we get far more extreme situations in these electronic communications, so which I won't tell you about, but we're quite fun. For them anyway. So thank you very much for warning me about that. That's very good. All right. So let's see, Anya, you're raising a deep question in philosophy of science, but I think the answer to both of your questions is yes. And it might be even that if we think about the broader scientific questions, the post hoc approach is actually the most powerful. The post hoc approach may well be the most powerful. And it may be that when we think that this is working out, it's because we're in relatively simple situations where the range of potential hypotheses is quite narrowly constrained. But of course, that's not characteristic of science generally. So if we're contrasting two or a small finite number of hypotheses, this approach seems to allow us a good contrastive approach. But it seems that we might need more than that in order to establish a theory. All right, Anna, so I think those are very helpful observations, and we should add those to the record of that discussion. But Anya, I also want to say, I don't think that what you're saying undermines my view about us not having sufficient evidence to accept Synod Armstrong and colleagues' position without those predictions. So I think in that case, that is a case where we need more. Maybe a lot of post hoc evidence would be enough, but we're far from having enough post hoc evidence there. I did think about that. You can kind of see that with the die. So if you think about the post hoc case, if you decided in advance on a method where you observed, let's say, 100 roles, but you decided in advance to divide those up into chunks of, say, 25, you can make the post hoc method work a lot better by saying then, what I'm looking for is whether there is a dominant number in each of the chunks, and that number is the same every time. What I'm doing there, in effect, is reducing the probability that the dice are unbiased, and I find reason to think that they're biased by chunking. So you can already see that imposing structure in the post hoc method can help you enormously. Great observation, Anya. All right, good. Baldwin, you agree with the second part. That's great. Okay, very good. Marvellous. I like that. We're in agreement. And now I'm muted. Okay, good. Very good. All right. So I think we've come to the end of the questions that I've got here. And that's nice because it's 1 o'clock. And there are other things that I have to do, and probably that you have to do as well. Oh, Nikki, answer the question that you asked me earlier. Nikki, I've got your question in my slides. I should have done your question ages ago. Nikki, thank you very much for being so patient. Thank you for mentioning this. And Nikki, I am so sorry. This is absolutely terrible. So you got your question in nice and early, and I therefore should have answered it. I'm so sorry, Nikki. Forgive me. All right. It's a good question, actually, and I really encourage you to have a think about this question. No worries. I am worried. I'm losing it. Anyway, there we go. Can I explain a bit more about how we could distinguish the judgment from the action, since the action in most experiments we've looked at is the act of judging it itself, namely filling in questionnaires. Now, Nikki, this is a very important question and one that's close to my heart. It's a good observation. And I know some of what you're thinking. What you're thinking is that this is just giving us a very narrow perspective on people's ethical abilities. And moreover, if we then think about the limited sample that is involved in many experiments, so we haven't looked at any experiments that involve different cultural groups, for example, we're very unlikely to be getting an interesting picture here. So I agree with you, it's very important and it's very close to my heart. So what can we do here? One thing I think is we can't very easily get at the judgment itself, right? So I tend to be, sometimes people think that using neurophysiological measures, we're going to get closer to the judgment itself. But there are various trade-offs involved in those neurophysiological methods, which I think, although they're important, won't directly solve your problem, Nikki. So what I'm suggesting, let's see if I've understood the question. What I'm suggesting is that there are two sources that we might use in getting at what you're after, the distinction between the judgment and the action. And one is studies which make a contrast between hypothetical judgments and judgments where there are real consequences. So what Gold and colleagues did in 2015 was to give people a series of problems and either to ask them what they would do or to observe what they actually did, to give them the opportunity to act with real consequences. I think these are economists, so they were using the kind of mini games that you find in game theory. They weren't actually pushing people off bridges in front of moving cars and that kind of thing, in case you were worried there. And what they found was very interesting, actually. So they actually found a discrepancy between what people said they would do and what people actually did when it came to it. So they had a contrast which is a bit like the trolley transplant contrast. So would you change the trajectory of a trolley in order to kill one person, saving 5? People tend to say yes. And the transplant case, would you kill a healthy person and distribute the organs in order to save 5 people? People tend to say no. And what they found is that when they asked people to make hypothetical judgments about how they would behave, they tended to say yes to the trolley-like case and no to the transplant case. But when they actually acted with consequences, they tend to act in the same way in both cases. So that was interesting. So one thought here, Nikki, is that we can compare cases, in all cases in a way, we've got actions. So we're not getting directly at the judgment, but we can compare what happens in a case where the judgment is hypothetical with a case where the judgment has real world consequences. The other thing we can do is just elaborate the kinds of action that we study. So later in the course, we'll spend some time with Kidwell and colleagues who did a rather brilliant study where they provided participants with various kinds of material advertising in one or another way the benefits of recycling, and then just measured the weight of their recycling bins over a period of several months. So they were looking at, this you could say is an ecologically valid study. So they were looking at participants in their ordinary ecological niche and measuring some behaviour that's part of their ordinary life rather than the lab-based behaviour. So Nikki, I think these two things might help a little bit with your question. The ultimate answer, I think, is to look at process dissociation models, which are formal methods designed explicitly to understand the factors behind an action, right? But I don't think we need to go there to see that there's an answer to that question. So Nikki, let me know, how satisfied are you with that answer? I'm sorry once again for its lateness, but have I answered the question there? Oh, Nikki, you have replied. Excellent. Good. I think I just can't see the difference between asking the questionnaire and the judgment itself. All right, Nikki, how about this? Suppose you come around and you ask me to make some judgments. Now, I might well be influenced by a couple of things. One of them is, what do I actually think about the matter? in the questionnaire, but the other is, what do I want you to think about me? And what you notice is that when people are given questionnaires, or any kind of question to answer, the social context of that experiment will always be one of the factors that influences their answers. So I'm thinking that what you say in answer to a questionnaire is an action. One of the factors that influences how you act will be indeed the judgment that you make, the belief that you hold, what you judge in the situation to be right and wrong. But other factors will also play a role. So how you want people to think about you, whether you think that the experimenter will maybe reward you or punish you. Participants often have a view about what the experimenter wants to hear and will often be influenced to give answers that will meet the experimenter's expectations. So when you say answering the questionnaire and the judgment itself, I think surely those are distinct, because the judgment is just one of many factors that influences what the answer is. So Nikki, am I missing something, or are we okay there? All right, good. Okay, we're there. Sorry, so I think I've made your question more complicated than you intended, and I'm sorry about that. But it's still an important question. It's still an important question. Absolutely. All right, we've going over. Thank you very much, everybody who's still here, for your questions. I really appreciated the questions this week. I thought they were absolutely brilliant, quite probing, quite deep. They show such a great level of thought about it. I'm particularly grateful to people who have helped in answering the questions as well. So when you put something into the chat or email me that provides a partial answer to these questions, I think that's enormously helpful. And I hope that that's how we're going to carry on answering the questions collectively. So of course I'm preparing the slides and doing the talking for the most part here, but I'm very much relying on at least a few people here who are also contributing material for the answers. That's extremely welcome. Thank you very much. Thank you for participating today. It's been enormous fun for me. I hope it's been fun for you. If you're in my seminar group, I'm looking forward to seeing you on Wednesday. Otherwise, I will see you on Thursday. Thank you very much. Take good care.